to liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the March 11, 2020 edition of Space News. This is Michael Abdillah, and tonight I'm joined by Tina Stagg and Angelo Di Grazia, and we are all from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get the show started with some Australian space news. Australian scientists are working on a small satellite to help spot bushfires. The CubeSat-class satellite will carry infrared sensors to identify regions with dry vegetation. Similar sensors are available on existing satellites today, like Europe's Sentinel-2 spacecraft, but the Australian satellite would be specifically tuned to monitor eucalyptus trees that constitute the majority of our forests. The satellite will be ready for launch in a couple of years. And turning to New Zealand, Rocket Lab will launch a synthetic aperture radar, or SAA, satellite for US space imaging company Capella this year. The companies announced the contract last week for a launch in the middle of this year, carrying a single SAR satellite on an Electron rocket. The launch will place the spacecraft into a medium inclination orbit, one not previously used by SAR satellites, but which Capella says can provide better coverage of some areas of interest. And over to Tina.
Thanks, Mike, and good evening, space fans. In NASA news, NASA has started to accept applications for the next class of astronauts. The agency will accept applications until March 31st. Applicants must be US citizens and have a master's degree or equivalent educational experience and be able to pass a long-duration spaceflight physical. NASA is beginning to study how to certify commercial suborbital vehicles for flights by NASA astronauts. In a speech at a suborbital research conference last week, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said he was interested in funding ways to certify such vehicles, like Blue Origin's New Shepard and Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two, for research and crew training by astronauts. NASA will look to adapt requirements created for the Commercial Crew Program for suborbital vehicles and use flight experience as a way to trade off some technical reviews. To NASA's Commercial Resupply Program, and Spacex successfully launched its final Dragon 1 mission to the International Space Station last week. A SpaceX Falcon 9 carrying the CRS-20 Dragon cargo spacecraft launched from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. The month-long mission sees the Dragon spacecraft deliver more than 1,950 kilograms of supplies and science to the space station before returning to Earth with the results of multiple scientific experiments, along with some surplus hardware. CRS-20 is the last flight of the first-generation Dragon spacecraft, with the cargo version of the upgraded Dragon 2 spacecraft expected to take over services next year as part of Phase 2 of the CRS program, also known as CRS-2. CRS-20 was the third flight for spacecraft C-112, which flew to the International Space Station in February 2017 and December 2018. The two-stage Falcon 9 rocket used in the flight was also a veteran. Its first stage also lofted the previous Dragon cargo mission in December last year. And the first stage also notched up another successful rocket landing, the 50th for the company overall. And to the Commercial Crew Program, NASA's investigation into Boeing's failed December spaceflight came up with a long list of corrections needed before the company flies again. Boeing said late last week that the investigation found about 61 corrective actions for the company's CST-100 Starliner spacecraft, which has been developing to fly NASA astronauts. NASA Associate Administrator Doug Lavero said he expected it would take several months for Boeing to work through the list. "This was a close call. We could have lost a spacecraft twice during this mission," Lavero said. Boeing said it implemented more rigorous testing to catch software problems found during the uncrewed flight test. John Mulholland, Vice President and Program Manager of Starliner at Boeing, said the company would apply additional rigour to systems engineering and software development. He said the two problems found during the flight, a timer that was 11 hours off and an incorrect software mapping for thrusters in the spacecraft service module, would have been caught had they done longer tests and used flight hardware rather than emulators. Mulholland said an ongoing software audit, while not complete, had not turned up any additional major problems. And to NASA's Space Launch System, and a NASA official says the first launch of the Space Launch System is now expected in the second half of 2021. Associate Administrator Steve Jerzik, speaking at a lunar technology event recently, said the Artemis 1 launch would take place in mid to late 2021. NASA has not yet announced a new formal launch date for that mission, after agency leadership said in December they no longer expected the launch to take place in 2020. Jerzik also said NASA was within weeks of awarding initial contracts for development of human lunar landing systems, and the agency would provide more details about its post-2024 lunar exploration plans in about a month. To NASA's planetary and space science programs, and NASA will be unable to communicate with its distant Voyager 2 spacecraft for nearly a year. The only antenna on its deep space network able to transmit to Voyager 2 will soon go offline for upgrades that will last 11 months in order to prepare for Mars missions. While other antennas will be able to receive data from the spacecraft, there will be no way for NASA to transmit anything. Project officials acknowledged being unable to talk to the spacecraft for that long was risky, but said they had planned as best they could to ensure the spacecraft could operate autonomously. A laser on NASA's Osiris-Rex asteroid mission has failed permanently. NASA said last month that one of the lasers on the Canadian-built Osiris-Rex laser altimeter had malfunctioned while the spacecraft was passing close to a potential landing site on the asteroid Bennu, which affected images of the site that the spacecraft was making. The low-power laser cannot be repaired, but the instrument's high-power laser is still working. Spacex has won a contract for the launch of a NASA asteroid mission. The company will launch a Psyche spacecraft on a Falcon Heavy in July 2022 for $117 million. Psyche will fly to the metal-rich asteroid of the same name, arriving in 2026 to orbit the asteroid and understand its origins. Over to Angelo.
Okay, thanks Tina. Let's go to the US Space Force. The budget for the US Space Force is projected to grow by $2.6 billion over the next 5 years, primarily for classified programs. Secretary of the Air Force, Barbara Barrett, submitted a report to Congress on projected budgets for the Space Force in the next 5 years. The $2.6 billion in growth is in addition to funds that will be transferred from Air Force to Space Force accounts. The increase is mostly for the procurement of classified space systems. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk has emphasised the importance of fully reusable vehicles like Starship. Speaking at an Air Force Association conference recently, Musk said reusable launch vehicles were absolutely fundamental to achieving whatever space ambitions the military might have, including staying ahead of China. I have zero doubt that if the United States does not create innovation in space, it will be second in space, he said. Let's go to Darpa. The Darpa Launch Challenge ended without a winner last week when Astra scrubbed its last launch attempt less than a minute before liftoff. Astra's Rocket 3 vehicle was scheduled to launch from Pacific Spaceport Complex, Alaska, but controllers halted the countdown 53 seconds before liftoff because of an off-nominal data from a sensor linked to the rocket's guidance, navigation and control system. The company could not resolve the problem before the launch window closed. Astra will miss out on a $2 million prize had it successfully reached orbit on this launch, plus $10 million if it had performed a second successful launch later in the month. Astra said it will likely try to launch again outside the competition in a week or two after resolving the problem. Astra was the last remaining competitor in the Darpa launch challenge. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Angelo. And turning to European Space Agency news, ESA has postponed critical parachute tests for its Exomars mission. The parachute tests, which were scheduled to take place in December and February in Oregon, are now scheduled for late this month. And in India, the Indian Space Agency ISRO postponed last week's scheduled launch of an Earth observation satellite. ISRO said technical reasons postponed the GSLV launch of the GISAT-1 satellite, but didn't elaborate on those reasons or say if they involved the rocket or spacecraft. A new launch date will be announced in due course, ISRO said. And in Canada, the Canadian Space Agency issued awards recently to several companies and universities to develop technologies for future exploration of the Moon. The 7 contracts, worth about $3.25 million, cover designs of lunar rovers, instruments and related technologies. The awards are part of the agency's Lunar Exploration Accelerator program, which plans to spend more than $100 million in 5 years on lunar exploration systems. And back to Angelo.
Thanks, Mike. And let's get to commercial space and SpaceX. Axiom has signed an agreement with SpaceX for a Crew Dragon mission to the International Space Station. Axiom will fly 3 private astronauts along with its own professional astronaut to the ISS on the mission scheduled for no earlier than the second half of 2021. The 10-day mission will include 8 days on the station and 2 in transit. Axiom says it expects to perform a series of such precursor missions to the station prior to the launch in late 2024 of a commercial module to add to the station, part of a long-term effort to develop its own free-flying commercial space station. SpaceX is expecting a major increase in the number of launches it conducts from its Florida launch sites, according to an environmental assessment published recently. The report, prepared as part of new and modified launch licenses for the company, projects 38 Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launches in 2020, increasing to 70 by 2023. That's an outstanding number there. The company will start performing launches to polar orbit from Florida, accounting for up to 10% of those launches, with the first such launch scheduled for late this month. The document also disclosed details about a mobile service tower the company is planning to construct at Launch Complex 39A to enable vertical payload integration, a requirement of some national security missions. Meanwhile, SpaceX's latest $250 million funding round, expected to close this month, would value the company at $36 billion, up from $33.3 billion in its previous round last year. Amazing. To Stratolaunch. Stratolaunch's giant aircraft will resume flights in September as the company turns its focus to high-speed flight test activities. At a conference last week, a company executive said the plane, which made a single test flight last April, will fly a series of test flights over an 8-month period as part of an FAA certification process. Stratolaunch originally built the plane to serve as an air launch platform, but the company has since pivoted to supporting flight test activities like hypersonics research using vehicles it plans to develop. Back to Mike.
Thank you, Angelo. And finally tonight, the European Southern Observatory says its telescopes will be moderately affected by mega constellations like SpaceX's Starlink. The study by ESO, which operates several large telescopes in Chile, concluded that a small fraction of its observations could be ruined by passing satellites. But the ESO said the problem was manageable and companies like SpaceX and OneWeb were taking concerns seriously. And that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Angelo. And we will speak to you again next week. Good night.